I'm really just someone who absolutely loves digital forensics. In particular, I've always loved mobile forensics. I've been doing it back since 2001, which is when mobile forensics were old school PDAs. And believe it or not, I got a call just this last week about someone needing to investigate a PDA. So you never know when a legacy device is going to come up again. So today I'm going to focus on a couple different things in regards specifically to mobile forensics. And this is a three-part series. So this series we're doing mobile, the next one is doing cloud, and then the final one is doing IoT. So you kind of get a nice broad topic coverage in this particular forensic arena. So first off, we're going to talk about some of the current challenges that we're facing in mobile forensics. It is fall time, so we just had our last firmware release for the year, so we have some new challenges that occurred with that one. We're going to talk about some of the standards that are used because we're doing digital forensics. Of course, we are a science, not an art, and so there are rules and standards that we have to abide by in order to be able to do mobile forensics. Then we're going to talk a little bit about tools and different techniques that are used, what kind of images that you would get when you're working with these particular devices, and kind of an expectation of some of the data. The reason for that is that all of you might not end up doing digital forensics in your career, but no matter where you go in a cyber career path, whatever it may be, you're going to touch into forensics in some way or digital forensics in some way. And it's because we're part of the incident response, we're part of ransomware, we're part of all of these different elements. There's always just a little sprinkle of digital forensics in there. And so it's good to understand kind of what the processes are and what those expectations of data might be. So if you're working with another team, you know what you can expect from them. Or if you hire an outside party, you know what you should be receiving back as part of that contract with them. And the last one then is going to be about our compliance requirements, some of the basics of evidence handling and chain of custody, because if you're on the front side of a cyber incident, let's say you have an incident and you're doing that response, you're part of that collection process, so you're the first part of it that's going to be touching the different data pieces that might end up going to a digital forensic group. And right now, we're going to focus on mobile. So as we talk about some of those current challenges in mobile forensics, get your questions ready. As it was mentioned, put them in the Q&A, and we're going to address them at the very end. So why mobile forensics is so hard? So out of all the digital forensics disciplines, I actually think it is the hardest. And the reason it is the hardest is because it is changing the most. It is always going through some kind of flex, some type of change. I'm sure all of you, since the webinar has started, you have picked up your mobile device, you flipped through something, you scrolled to the side, you maybe took a picture of a screen that's already happened, but you're constantly using that mobile device. So it is obviously our most personal device and our digital fingerprint that we deal with. Because it is always in flex, that makes it one of the more difficult to collect, and it also makes it one of the more difficult to make sure that you're always getting the most amount of data from it because of that flex nature of it. This is our primary location beacon, if you want to think of that, until we end up with chips embedded inside of us. This is really what's telling everyone where you are and what you're doing. And so we find it to be a really critical component of our digital fingerprint. So if we're doing any type of investigation, it is probably the primary piece of evidence. If you think of your laptop, you're really using your laptop in a certain number of hours of every day, but your mobile device is almost always with you. I know for me, I woke up this morning to my mobile device alarm, and I'm sure many of you had the same thing. So from the moment we wake up to the moment we go to sleep, from doing our doom scrolling, we know we're touching this mobile device. So the other problem that we have is associated with technical barriers. And this is because we end up with massive firmware releases that happen every year with mobile devices. When we look at our Windows systems, Linux, Mac, any of those, we're really not seeing that shift happen with a massive architectural change that's happening as frequently as we do with mobile devices. And because of that, it makes them a more difficult device to deal with in forensics. The other side of it is the law hasn't kept up with them. You think about it, you're carrying around a piece of your digital fingerprint that can change time zones spontaneously. It is always in flux, it is always moving, and in doing so, it's also changing different legal authority based on its physical location at a given time, and the data transfer it does in that particular physical location. So there's a lot of legal sticky that happens associated with it. Our final areas, of course, is about the volume of data. Now we're looking at a minimum of, I kind of have an expectation I'm going to have a terabyte of data I'm dealing with on a particular phone, or at least over 100 gigabytes of data with most devices. Because of that, you have issues with your transfer rate because you have limited connection options, and of course you have lots of little teeny pieces of data that you have to go through and review. The last part is, of course, our time sensitivity. Mobile devices are considered a FIFO, which is the first in, first out principle. Because that device is going to change, it's going to lock, it's going to go through all those different things, you have to process it immediately. It's not one of those that you kind of shelf it and say, hey, I'm doing another project and I'm going to come back to this later. It has to be a now thing. And because of that, it makes it a little more high maintenance than some of the other digital items in forensics. So let's talk about our technical hurdles. So our first problems are with Android. I'm primarily an Android user. It's my preferred system. And because of that, I kind of live in this hurdle every day. So our biggest problem we have with our Android devices is there's so many. Depending on where you're coming in from around the world, Android might be the most popular device in your particular region. And there might be 5 different manufacturers of it. Then you have different telecom providers that produce them, and they do slight changes to the Android device as well as the telecom provider. All of that creates problems for us as it comes in as digital forensics, because those modifications are going to make the device perform differently when we start to do acquisitions, to do analytics associated with it. So you have to keep that in mind when it comes to Android devices. That diversity that happens with them makes them harder to deal with on the forensic side. It has different security implications associated with every single one of those manufacturers as well. So I might have something different happen on a Pixel device than I might have happen on a Samsung device or a Motorola device or a Huawei device. All of those things are going to impact what I'm going to get in my expectation of data. And at the end of the day, that's really what mobile forensics focuses on, is what type of data I'm going to get from these particular devices. That's when we get different ROM changes, again, manufacturers, different devices, all of that. And then unique features that come with specific devices. So Samsung has Knox as an example, which is its security protocol associated with it. One of the other things that we're seeing that are just emerging now with our devices this fall now is our AI changes. So we're getting our devices that are now doing integrated AI associated with them. And so we're going to have to make shifts and adjustments for that. For example, during this webinar, I just recently changed my mobile device and I made sure I turned it off just so it simply wasn't listening to all the things I say, because it's going to change the performance of where it's directing me on the particular device based on overhearing what I'm saying in this conversation with each one of you. So let's talk Apple. So Apple has its own challenges. Believe it or not, it actually is an easier acquisition process in a lot of ways because it's all one manufacturer, one device. We don't get a variance that happens with the different models of the iPhone. Because it all comes off of one hardware provider, we have a very easy expectation to hit. The problem we have is when it starts hitting some of the encryption and the implementation that Apple does, that's when we start having the barriers associated with it. That's when we have unique things where we're not able to take the latest iPhone model and be able to do a physical image of it or a file system image of it. Those types of problems come because it is coming from a manufacturer that is very dedicated to not necessarily love mobile forensics, I'm going to put it that way. It makes it so they're purposely trying to limit and protect the privacy of the end user over the validity of what we're going to get out of it from a digital forensic perspective. So we kind of have that tug of war that occurs with Apple in particular. The other side of it that can make Apple a little harder to deal with is some of the app sandboxing. The way that it functions, it makes it so we can't implement different acquisition methodologies that allow us access into apps, like we can with the way that Android will go through and sandbox its app. So some of those little teeny things that happen and tweak between our different primary two firmware manufacturers are really going to impact what we're doing in digital forensics. The other side of it, though, is it also impacts what the potential cyber attacks can be associated with these devices. It makes it so it's easier for you to choose on a security perspective to maybe what implementation am I going to choose? How am I going to implement that MDM, the mobile device management system? What type of devices are we going to allow? You kind of, by understanding the back forensic process, it allows you to make better security choices as well. So now let's talk about some of our standards. So this one is not exciting, but it's kind of a slide for informational purposes, because the standards that we have associated with doing some of the digital forensic labs have not really picked up quite the same way as you would expect. Not every lab on the planet is hitting any one of these particular standards. Some labs will say, hey, I am this certified, I'm this certified, whatever it may be. However, probably upwards as high as 95% of the labs out there don't go through this type of certifications. Instead, what they're doing as their standards is they're implementing the proper workflow. So doing the right digital forensic workflow that might come in with these particular devices, and you get little branches off that workflow based on the type of data you're working with. And that is an acceptable practice when it comes to looking at your standards for mobile forensics. It doesn't require those same regulatory standards as some of the other types of labs out there, which is unique to this particular space. So it's something to keep in mind kind of in the back of your mind, but it isn't necessarily a requirement for you to be able to process and do mobile devices. What is required is a proper workflow. So one of the workflows out there, and this applies actually no matter what type of digital evidence you're dealing with, is you kind of follow this 4-step process that is your digital forensic process. If I were going to do this for mobile, I would write up my documentation or my lab protocols based on these 4 stages, and that would become what is going to be my scientific forensic process I'm implementing within my lab. Documentation is very, very important, because if we don't have that, and we don't have a structure like this in our lab, we're going to end up looking more like a bunch of artists coming together and working with mobile devices, as opposed to having a specific scientific process associated with them. So please keep that in mind, that you do actually have to do quite a bit of documentation, and this is not going to be something that you're going to say, hey, let me pop this into AI and have them write up this documentation for me. You want to make sure it's something that is sustainable no matter how small or big your lab is, and then it also gets reviewed frequently. For example, my lab that I have running at Paraben, our professional services lab, we review our documentation every 6 months to make sure we don't need to do any changes based on how technology has changed, or flaws that we might have had within our workflow that need to be improved because of how we were getting different data points from different tools, whatever it may be. So remember, it's not a one and done scenario. This is you're going to constantly be editing it and working with it in the future. All right, so let's hit our tools and techniques. I'm really hoping everyone has played the game of Tetris, because my next examples kind of involve the game of Tetris, as you can see on the side of the screen there. So when we look at our acquisition techniques, I would use Tetris to explain it. And the reason that I like to use something that is very familiar, kind of a global familiarity, is if I were having to explain this to a jury, I would be able to use a similar analogy to explain it to them. And I've tested this because I've tried to explain highly complex features or functions associated with mobile forensics, and I've used my mom as an example. So she would be a good jury member. She doesn't have a technical background at all. And so if I can get her to understand what I'm trying to explain, then I know I've hit the nail on the head to make sure that it's going to be explainable to everyone. So when we look at our data acquisition techniques for mobile forensics, we're really looking at data that sits similar to how Tetris cubes or lines sit. It's just inserted inside one another in different spaces, trying to occupy the most space possible. It doesn't like to wait. We don't have fragmentation. We don't have slack associated with our files associated with mobile devices. It tries to keep them really tight and compact as part of the overall firmware file system associated with these devices. The reason for that is obviously we've only evolved to have more data storage on these devices, but our original mobile devices really didn't have that much storage with it, so they wanted to make sure they were managing it as tightly as possible. If I were going to do a full physical image of this particular mobile device, and it was representing all of the data in this Tetris board that I've put inside the mobile there, I want to make sure that I'm getting a full representation of that space. I'm not going to end up getting a traditional bitstream image like I would off of a computer. Instead, I would get kind of a dump of data. So the most common way that I'm going to get a full physical image off of a mobile device is I'm going to get it through a chip dump. The reason why that is the best methodology for a full physical image is because that's me talking directly to the chip on the board that is managing over this Tetris game on the other side. If I try to talk to just the operating system or the firmware associated with the device, I can get a very different picture to what this particular data storage is going to look like. So I am technically doing embedded system forensics. I'm not actually just doing mobile forensics. And because of that, communication to that chip on the board can be very impactful if I want to do a physical image. That's probably the best way to get a physical image, whether you're doing it in a lab or you're having another lab produce it for you. You might get a file system image depending on what type of tool you're using, which means that they're going to get access to a portion of this particular area that is locked away from traditional user interaction. They can only interact through the device itself, but a lot of their user-oriented data that they can change isn't available to them in that area. It's only system data. Those file system images can give me some good information about my user's behavior on the device and how they're using it, but it doesn't necessarily bring in every piece of data associated with it. A full file system image is just more of those blocks than what I would get if I were doing a logical image. And a logical image is what I'll talk about on the next slide. But these are things you have to keep in mind is what am I going to get based on each type of imaging that is available for the very specific model of device I have, as well as the firmware associated with those devices. Each one of those factors will contribute to the type of image I'm getting, which is interesting in comparison to computer forensics. If I look at computer forensics and I'm doing a Windows 10 versus a Windows 11, I'm going to get the exact same style of image off of both of those devices. It's not going to change dramatically. I should be able to get a bitstream image from either one of those operating systems. But if I just change in between different iOS versions from iOS 16 or 17 or 18 up into iOS 26, I'm going to get very different types of images based on each one of those changes, and then also based on each physical device it's implemented on. So that's one of the other areas that makes mobile forensics a little bit more complex, is you don't have the same expectation of data off of every single device. It's going to change individually based on not only each device, but it also will change a little bit based on the wear and tear on the device as well. So that does create problems with it. Other challenges you have with this is typically in digital forensics, when you're doing technology implementation for these different types of imaging, you're going outside of the scope of normal technology. So if I were just to design an app that said, hey, I want to play a game on this device and it's going to do, dogs chasing a bone, and it's going to have this app that makes this happen. Great, easy, super easy to implement, done. However, if I say, hey, I want to do an app that is designed to get full file system access, I have to have different access controls and everything else. Those restrictions are going to change what I'm able to implement within the device. And a lot of times they will simply just not be allowed. And so I'll have to go through a technique, whether it's looking at an iPhone and deciding to jailbreak it, or going through and rooting an Android device. I'm going to have different things outside of traditional scope of use that I would want to implement to get the most possible data. So if I look at logical, I have the same graphic for you, but it's structured a little differently. Now, if I want to look at all of those different options, I want to be able to pick all those individual pieces that might represent different data stores with it. It might represent my LinkedIn, it might represent Twitter, it might represent X, it might represent Facebook, it might represent WhatsApp. Each one of those blocks is going to represent a different app, different pieces of data, different things like that. So as I communicate to this device, I have to collect all those different blocks as individual pieces, and those get acquired over with my device. It's simply a change in my technique. However, the file system area, I'm not going to be able to see it the same way as a logical image, because that area is going to be restricted for me. I'm not going to be able to capture that information. That's when we go back to our physical imaging techniques or access into a full file system image. We hit that wall and we're not able to see beyond the wall of that data. And because of that, we're going to get less data with a logical acquisition, but we are going to get a lot of the user accessible data associated with a logical image. And that's one of the big contrasts that you see. I won't get all of it, but I am going to get a lot of what the user is able to touch, change, and see, which is really where I'm going to focus a lot of my investigation in general. Is obviously it's associated with what the user is doing. So the advantage of doing a logical image over doing a physical image is obviously the process is much faster because, again, you're dealing with less data associated with it. And it's a little easier to have a set expectation of it. So a lot of the factors that say, hey, this model of device can no longer do a physical image associated with it, you'll be able to have a generic result associated with logical imaging, which you can't quite get the same amount of physical imaging that change per model and per firmware. So it's a little easier to write into a standard process than it is to write that in for a physical imaging. And it is important to note between these two imaging as recoverable data, we don't call it deleted data when it comes to mobile forensics, but recoverable data can be available with both imaging formats. So that's one of the advantages you have. You're not just limited to, hey, if I only get physical images, it's the only time I'm going to see any recoverable information from my mobile device. That's not the case because mobile device data does work differently. It works in those structured blocks, and because of that, I'm able to still recover information from them. So let's talk about some of our acquisition techniques. So we'll talk Apple first this time. So for Apple, the most common method that is probably the easiest standard is taking an iTunes backup and processing that archive is the equivalent of a logical image. It's been the most common process we've had for Apple devices for a very, very long time, since we actually did the very first Apple devices back in the day. So it is one of the things that people consider the bare minimum standard. So that's something that you can work with. When forensic tools implement a logical imaging associated with an Apple device, they're typically doing it with an encryption option active, which allows us to collect things like your keychain data associated with your Apple device. And it allows us to get information, for example, if you have an Apple Watch, your health data is associated with some of that keychain information. So that can come through as part of our logical image. So that is something that is unique where we kind of implement something similar to an iTunes backup, but it's implemented uniquely by each and every tool. Now, just because each and every tool implements something similarly does not mean you're going to get the exact same image from every tool that you use. So it is so important to test that. So we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Other options we have on Apple devices is, of course, there are jailbreaks available out there. They do not go up into anywhere near the current firmware versions. So again, that limitation. When a device is jailbroken, it means that wall that blocked us out of that file system has essentially been removed, which means I'm going to be able to get more access to more data based on my imaging technique. So I can expect more data, but that data is going to then have access into file system information I did not have before. There's a variety of different commercial solutions out there that go through and do imaging with Apple devices. I can list them all because there's always going to be pop-up happening. One of the important things, however, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the tools and techniques, is that you make sure you're using the tool that is designed for digital forensics. There are a lot of tools out there that are not designed for digital forensics, which means they are not doing that workflow that you really need on the back end that allows you to be a forensic process and to be a science as opposed to an art. So you want to make sure you're using something that is a forensic grade tool. There are also open source options available out there associated with all the different types of mobile forensics, so keep that in mind, but they still have to be validated the same way you do commercial tools. So when we look at our Apple devices, here are artifacts. And when I say the artifacts, I can't obviously in a short period of time go into all the different artifacts there are associated with Apple, but it's key things you want to look for. So you want to look for property lists. Those are plist files. Those are most common on Apple devices. That's kind of going to give you perspective into different apps. So that's part of what you're looking for. It looks like XML file data. So it's fairly easy for you to do analytics on manually if the tool doesn't parse it. And it also is easy for you to verify the parsing results of your tool. You might find SQLite database, and it's kind of the database that rules them all at this point. So you'll be able to see those associated with different apps. You'll see keychain data, as I mentioned. Keychain data is all the logins you've done to all of your different websites, any Wi-Fi access you've done, all your passwords that you store with Apple, all the things that Apple has done to make things convenient for you to use them. They automatically save that information, and we look at that information in digital forensics as part of our investigative process. The last thing you might find is, of course, any of your temporary files associated with the device. So those might be WAL files that will be recoverable, that you can see that particular moment of time associated with your Apple device. So here is just an example for you of what it looks like when I would go through and process an Apple device. If any of you are really new and you're exploring into digital forensics, one of the first things you should do is take a look at your own personal device. Really kind of break it down. It's the data you're most familiar with, but try to get a trial of some of the commercial tools out there, or download the open source tools, and really process your own device and kind of see what it looks like. See if you find the data you put into WhatsApp, was it still recoverable through the tool you used? Compare and contrast two different tools that you've implemented or tried out to see if you're seeing the information that you would expect to see. So let's talk Android. So Android is going to have a couple more pieces to it because it's a little more complex because of the large amounts of data spread or device spread that we have. With so many different manufacturers out there for Android devices, you get a lot more variance between the different techniques for particular devices. The most common, and the one that is actually built into Android itself, is an ADB backup, which is an Android debug bridge. This is something that you can do with the Android development kit or the SDK associated with it. You can make a backup of the device, and then you can process through some of that information. Without some of the enhancements that have happened through the commercial forensic tools, you're going to get very minimal amount of data from it. So it's going to be a little bit of a sad moment for you if that's your only method you're going to implement in there. What has happened is your digital forensic tool providers that are commercial have now added kind of an enhancement and given that ADB backup some superpowers that have made it so it is capturing more data. So an example is it does an ADB downgrade. That's when it will take apps and take them from one version to the next version or a lower version to be able to capture that information on how it interacted within the firmware it has. So your commercial tools are going to take things that are kind of a structure within Android itself and then kind of amp them up a little bit to be more forensically sound in their methodology. They might implement rooting as a mechanism, which is great because that's allowing me again to do that file system access. So I want to get the most possible data. And so they'll use rooting for that. One of the advantages you have with rooting is it does very little changes on the device that are detrimental to user data, which is one of the things you have to pay attention to when you decide to do different implementations. Android 16 is still rootable at this point, and that's our current release of Android. And so we know that this is a good technique we could use for other Android devices. Other options you have are changing up some of the boot processes. A lot of those are not as successful as they used to be because of some of the security mechanisms that have been put in place by different manufacturers. So it is very important to read up on the documentation for it and make sure you're picking something that is not going to damage the device itself or damage the data that you're trying to capture with it. And then the last one that is probably the most popular when it comes to doing physical imaging of our Android devices is to do what's called a chip dump. A chip dump allows me to communicate directly to the chip on the board and then drop a full physical image of that particular device. And that was that method I talked about earlier, which is following more of those embedded system forensics. So the acquisition tools for Android are there's a much longer list associated with it. And the reason I wanted to point this out is because the Android is a little bit more in that it's not really open source community anymore, but because it's a little bit more friendly within a community of working with others as far as the code goes, you see a couple more tools available for it. So you have anything from the tool that I make, which is Paraben's tools. Obviously, Celebrate works within both of those. You might have microsystemation, you have Oxygen, Magnet, etc. But the big thing is you actually have what the manufacturer has made itself, which is it has its own SDK associated with it so that you can customize some of your own tools to deal with Android directly. And of course, you have some other digital forensic open source tools available. The same thing applies to Android as it does to Apple, where you should go out and try to get demonstration versions or trial versions and kind of experiment a little bit. Anyone who's working in the field of cyber should not limit themselves to just using one mobile device. You really need to be having both mobile devices available to you to make sure you're familiar with both of them and the changes they go through, because it's going to make it so you have a better understanding of their security posture as well as kind of what their forensic results are. So although I'm a primary Android user, I still have an Apple device that I keep with me that kind of keeps going and actually maintains one of my soft puppets so that I can see how data interacts within the Apple file system as well. So with Android, we have a couple changes with our files that we're looking for, which is our SQLite file is our primary file we're going to focus on because that's what we're going to see with our apps. And those people spend their time with their apps. Then we're going to have XML files, which is pretty common. Again, both of these very easy to go through and kind of break down. There's lots of viewers for them, and most of your forensic tools have viewers associated with them. I always want to make sure when I look at an app, I'm looking at the entire directory structure as well, because the app is going to have, for example, in SQLite, I might have one directory that has a database that is all the messaging and another one that has all the attachments associated with it. And I need to be able to put that puzzle back together again and be able to manually verify what my commercial or my open source tool has shown me in their automation. So that is an important aspect, is being able to manually verify things. The other side is you hit a Google operation parameter associated with it. So you've got to be familiar with how Google is actually functioning and working with the devices to make sure that you're looking for all the associated artifacts. This is just a quick example of what an Android looks like. You see similar structure associated with it. I realize you're seeing these very quickly on the screen, but you're going to see the expectation of kind of your default apps. You'll see all of that information. But the big thing is that you're looking for primarily, you're going to start within your third-party apps. That's really where I start because that's telling me the most about what my potential suspect is doing. Your app use says a lot about you, and it kind of gives me where my first step would be in an investigation. One of the important things that you have within this process, though, as I mentioned multiple types of tools, is I always like to compare my results between the two of them. So this is a case compare from E3. This is a difference between the two different Apple firmwares, since we just had a big release with iOS 26 come out, and this is part of my testing process between the two of them, where I see different databases available between the two different types of devices. The device actually only went through a reboot in between image A and image B, but in that reboot, it updated to iOS 26. So what new databases did I have? What other databases were removed as part of the upgrade? All of those things are part of what I do as a regular testing whenever I have a large firmware come out, because I have to validate my tools are working with that new firmware, and then I'm still capturing the same amount of data and then any new data that they've added with that firmware release. So you have to go through some extra steps in the process. All right. So really quick, we're going to look at some quick timelines. I know sometimes I run for talking times and I'm going to run out of time. So when you look at your devices, one of the most important things that you can do is kind of look at a timeline. And I say that because it comes up a lot, as you'll see different articles about it, is creating different timelines really gives you a scope of where your device has been, because that's part of your investigation. It allows me to compare what the device was doing versus what my user was doing, what kind of communications were happening with it, any location data associated with it, where was it physically located. All of those little artifacts can be found on your mobile device, so creating a timeline can be a great first step as well. This really tells you what are you focused in with. Usually if it's an incident, then you know you're working within a window of a couple hours. Perhaps maybe you've got it down within 30 minutes of when that incident occurred or when it might have been exfiltrated within an environment. So keep that in mind, that a timeline is one of the first things that you create. Now, the way I used to do my timelines associated with it is I used to actually put them in a spreadsheet and kind of take all my data points and kind of create a manual timeline to really understand what my data is doing. Now with the emergence of AI, I think this is one of the things that AI has done the best for us in digital forensics, is it is fantastic about taking multiple data points and creating a timeline for me. And that is allowing me to kind of get my general scope of my device before I start diving into the individual data pieces and really breaking those out. So, I know my focus, for example, might have been I'm focused on WhatsApp, or I'm looking at conversations that happen in WhatsApp and then they switch to talk to new people in Facebook Messenger. Whatever it might be, I can see some patterns of use that occur through a timeline review of a device that are different than what I can see by just looking at that raw data sample with it. So this is probably the first area that I full on decided I'm going to implement the use of AI in my investigations, is to really give me that base timeline that then I work off of to continue through the rest of my device. So it kind of gives me a little bit of a map, so to speak. Which brings us into AI. I don't think you can watch a presentation anymore without having AI brought up, because honestly, AI is probably the largest technology innovation that I've seen happen in my lifetime. I thought for a while there it was actually mobile devices, and now AI has just exponentially just crushed it with how fast it has come out and how fast it has evolved. So like I said, I use it with timeline analysis. That's a big deal. I can use multiple sources of data. I can add in CVR data with an AI and then take my mobile data and have the two details put together. I can also have correlation occur, which is much faster than how I used to do it manually. The big thing that I've noticed in my use of AI is that it is making it so I can get to a data review point much faster than I could when I was manually doing all the data myself. I'm still having to produce the data through forensic tools and really do my acquisitions, but AI is really coming in handy when it comes to doing my analytics to really help to improve what I'm looking at. In a lot of ways, because a lot of AI is conversational, it also feels like you almost have an extra investigator working with you to kind of almost bounce ideas off of, but it's really focused in on the data. If you're going to use AI in your forensics, you do need to make sure that it is also following the rules and processes of forensics. I'm not going to go and talk in an active investigation into ChatGPT and say, hey, what do you think of this? Make sure you're using something that was designed for forensics and you understand how it is keeping the data secure and private. If it is not doing that, simply don't use it. It doesn't work within that forensic rules and structure. So here's another example for you of text message within AI, just as an example of just two pieces of information coming together. I was able to see the same information on my forensic tool, but then I was able to add in data I got from the computer, so I could see a full dump of information from multiple data sources. And that's one of the things that I found to be valuable when it comes to using AI within digital forensics. Our last little area is on compliance. So compliance, it's not super exciting. Nobody really gets, like, let's talk about compliance. However, it is the foundation that makes us a science. And because of it, we really have to make sure that we're doing things like our tool validation. I've mentioned that a couple times, and how I'm comparing different results from tools. I'm making sure I understand off of baseline devices what I should expect from different tools. I'm also making sure I maintain my educational process, doing continuing education, whether it's through webinar series or taking new certification classes. That is absolutely essential when it comes to being in the field of digital forensics, because you're having to understand to a deeper depth the data than you might have to if you were just focused on it on the incident response side, because you've got to be able to take apart those pieces of data. So there's a lot of details when it comes to the digital forensic side of things. The other side of things that come into this is when we do an investigation within our lab environment, we really try to keep it within a group of 3 for a peer review process associated with evidence, because different people are going to see data differently. They might understand different lexicons associated with the messaging and get a different meaning off of what the data is actually saying to us, just based on generation. So we try to do a peer review as part of it. That is not a legal requirement. It is not a compliance requirement. It is simply a good use requirement. this says you're going to get a better result in the end if you can actually do that type of information. And then the last thing is that documentation thing I mentioned to you earlier. No one ever loves talking about documentation, but like our lab has manuals that are the processes and procedures that you follow with each particular type of device, so that everyone, no matter who is processing it, is going through that exact same process, making it a science, not an art. Our last little piece is that chain of custody piece I mentioned earlier today, which was making sure that if you're on the incident response side of it and you want to pass things off to someone in digital forensics, make sure as you collect that data, you realize you are that first step within that chain of custody. You're the first person to touch it, and it's going to record everyone who touches that data after that point. It's very important because you never know when you're going to go to court. So I just look at it as always maintain a good chain of custody and just assume every piece of data you have, no matter what it is collected for, is maintained so it can go to a court standard or a legal standard. I call it forensic grade. That way I know it's verifiable, I know I can track it, and I know exactly where it's been. If you don't maintain that, it's not something you can make up for later on. Trying to put that together later on does not work. You have to maintain it from the very beginning. So if you do have an incident, then start your chain of custody associated with any of your collections you're doing. Keep track of it, hash it as part of the process for verification of the data file. All those little teeny steps don't take a lot of time and overhead, but they make a huge difference to make sure that you're getting the closest to forensic grade as possible. So one of the things, and I'm a visual learner, I'm sure many of you are as well, I've always liked this graphic. I have this actually done for different workflows associated with our lab processing, because this is telling people what they should be doing to make sure they're following the proper steps associated with it. Similar things need to happen if you're going to decide to do a lot more digital forensics or mobile forensics within this particular discipline. You have to kind of define what your hypothesis is, what you're looking for, and then how is it going to apply through this entire process. Because this is what makes it that scientific process as opposed to an art. Otherwise, I would have just shown you a picture of a cute dog and I would have been done and said, just make it look as close to a dog as you want to. Whatever works. That doesn't work in digital forensics, and it definitely doesn't work in mobile forensics. We always make sure we have that scientific process. So whether you're going through and doing the process yourself, or you're going through and you're hiring someone to do the process for you, make sure you understand that they actually have a process and that it's documented. A lot of people will start doing this and then they didn't think about any of the science and documentation. You want to verify that all of that information is there before you choose to hire someone. So our summary real quick before we end up going through some other steps in this webinar. The big thing is there's a lot more information you need to really understand these devices to be able to do a good job processing. If some of this sounded very interesting to you and exciting, then maybe it's time to pursue some deeper learning, really take a class on mobile forensics and getting into the weeds of how does the Android file system work? How does the iOS file system work? You know, how do I actually do these acquisition steps? Experiment and try things. That's really how you find out that a field is good and interesting to you. Make sure you also are only doing your own stuff. And I say that because I encourage each one of you to download trial versions of different tools out there. Do not process someone else's devices. You will be very unhappy on what that will do to your different relationships out there. Make sure you focus on your own devices because legal authority really does matter. And you do not have a right to just go through and take someone's device and start imaging it in forensics. So keep that in mind. Stick to your own devices. Make sure you try it with multiple tools. You're going to see very different results between tool A and tool B. You'll see different results between commercial tools and open source tools. And one might be better at one thing than another thing. And it's why we kind of have multiple selections. I don't have a single day of my life that my toolbox has ever just had one screwdriver in it. It has about 30. So because of that, you never know which one you're going to need to pick up. So it's the absolute same thing when it comes to software. Make sure that you have a variety of them available to you so that you know when to pick up the one that matches the device you might be processing. So that's our multiple methods. My recommendation, start looking at your timelines a little bit more. That's an excellent way to start into an investigation because it gives you a map of what was happening in the use that you were working with for the particular device. It's a lot of data to weed through, and it's one of the easiest ways to step into your suspect's shoes potentially and understand what they have. And the last one, of course, get more education. This is a field of constant learning. I am always learning new things as well. There's always someone new out there that's come up with a new technique. I'm following lots of people in social media. I'm taking different classes. I'm watching things online, all of those different things. Get out there and talk to them and see what you can learn. Sign up for some good blogs. You never know what you're going to find out. I think that AI is not going to change necessarily the acquisition process associated with our mobile devices. I haven't seen an implementation that's going to be impactful there. It's going to make a huge difference in the analytics process. And I say that because putting a bunch of data into an AI to say, let me correlate the information to find all the communication between Amber and Bob that happened on this date, the response time that an AI can do versus having to do it through a traditional searching or through a manual lookup is massive. It's so fast in comparison. And then what I do as part of my process is I limit my AI so it can't find an answer anywhere else. I'm saying you can only look at the data I'm providing to you, different things like that. So I'm using it the same as I would within forensics, but the response is 30 seconds and it finds an answer, as opposed to me as a human doing it, it's like 3 days to be able to make sure I correlate the exact same data. What's going to happen is that humans will have to go through and then take the result that the AI has given and then cross-verify that back manually with the data. But analytics-wise, I have 3 children, they're all in college and doing different paths in life. And say you better learn how to do good prompt engineering, because if you don't, you're going to be left behind. It doesn't matter what your job is. So it's interesting because we haven't seen legal authorities make a hard line that says, oh, hey, AI created this timeline, so I'm not going to accept it. It doesn't come down to that. It comes down to how the AI is actually designed and how you're implementing it to create that timeline. So I used an AI that was designed for digital forensics specifically, so that I know exactly how my data is obfuscated. I know that it's always kept siloed, it's always encrypted, and it is not able to communicate with anything outside of that data set to be able to generate its timeline. So all the things I would want to do that would verify my forensic tool produced, I've done the exact same thing with my AI tool. It really is just another tool for it. It wouldn't change a legal authority being able to accept that data, because it's the same difference of me using hand washing a dish or putting a dish in a dishwasher. One is, they're both still washing a dish, it's just one is a more automated process than the other one, and it might end up giving me a better result at the end of the day. So I don't think there's a legal authority issue with it. I do think there's a problem with just saying, hey, let me use ChatGPT to do my forensics, because you haven't verified any of how that backend is actually functioning and working with the data. How is it keeping it secure? How is it limiting its scope to just that data? You have to use something that's been designed specifically for this space. So that would depend on the phone model and the firmware edition that phone has. Certain tools with earlier editions would be able to attempt to bypass that passcode to be able to get into that device. They typically go through a brute force attack to do that, so you're still waiting for a period of time for that brute force to occur. A 6-character code can take months to years to break into, so it's not something that's going to be an instantaneous snap like that, not by any means. There is no methodology out there that is that instantaneous snap. It's just not a choice. It's all in how Apple has executed its security parameters, the way it ties itself to the chiplet it has on the board, with the fact they're their own chip manufacturer. All of those things will impact the way that you can bypass into those particular devices. So there is no quick fix for that one. So it depends is my answer. A lot of tools are trying to bridge that gap in between them, because really your mobile device has migrated to be kind of a terminal to the cloud, if you want to think of it that way. And because of that, if you acquire the mobile device, you're definitely going to touch out the cloud data. The biggest problem we have with collection of cloud data is actually legal authority. because depending where the cloud is located, obviously that changes whether or not it's in the scope of your original investigation or if it's outside of that original scope. But it is absolutely accessible and capturable, and that's what we're going to talk about in our next Sticker series. But make sure you go out and experiment, sign up for some trials, and take a look at your own phone. It's the first step in mobile forensics, is understanding what your own data looks like.